My hands were moving faster than my thoughts, fingers stitching patches across a bleeding network while the loss counter kept climbing. Every minute, the ransomware stayed alive. The company was burning $110,000, and everyone in the room knew it. The room was scorching hot. But as I wrote these lines, I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine, so I had to pull the blanket up to my chin. I don't know where you are. What's the temperature right now, if you're still listening to me? Leave a lucky yours number in the comments. At that very moment, Gordon Sykes stepped into the command room. He didn't ask what we were containing. He didn't look at the dashboard screaming in red behind me. He didn't even slow his stride. The new COO scanned the room like it was a budget meeting, not an active breach, then stopped behind my chair, in front of the incident response team, with my commands still echoing through headsets. He said it flat and clean. "We're cutting costs. Your role ends now." For a second, no one spoke. The malware didn't care. Alerts kept firing. I turned halfway, waiting for the follow-up that never came. Gordon nodded to IT and told them to revoke my access immediately. Not after containment, not after handoff. Now, I was being removed in real time, while the system I built was under attack. I am Emily Harper, Director of Cyber Defense. I designed the architecture keeping this company alive at that moment. Gordon Sykes came from mergers and acquisitions, a man fluent in spreadsheets and exits, untouched by a real cyber incident. He believed speed mattered more than understanding. I could have argued. I could have warned them what would happen next. Instead, I did exactly what policy required. I removed my headset, stood up, and logged out of every system cleanly, deliberately, without a word, no instructions, no alerts, no final safeguard. The room stayed silent as my access disappeared. Behind me, the loss counter kept climbing, and the first cracks of panic began to show. Before we continue, I'd like to pause for a moment. What you're about to hear is a fictional story built on real professional experiences and situations, with some elements created using artificial intelligence to bring the story to life. I hope it leaves a lasting impression and gives you an engaging experience. And if you're feeling tired, please take some time to rest and take care of your health. After the noise faded, watching the incident channel fill with messages that were no longer addressed to me, the silence felt deliberate, not calm. Deliberate, as if years of work had been compressed into a single decision and labeled unnecessary. Over 5 years. I had stopped 3 major breaches before they reached customers. I kept system downtime under 0.2%. Even during acquisitions that doubled our infrastructure overnight, I wrote the cybersecurity insurance policy line by line, translating risk into language executives could understand, making sure the company stayed covered when things went wrong. None of that made it into the meeting summary. Gordon Sykes thrived in those summaries. As COO, he spoke in margins and timelines. Security budgets were trimmed because they slowed momentum. Warnings were dismissed as overly cautious. My emails flagged as friction instead of foresight. He liked to say protection was invisible when it worked, which made it easy to pretend it wasn't necessary. The emergency meeting proved his point. Gordon leaned back, glanced at the agenda, and announced, "We don't need heroes. We need speed." Heads nodded. Speed sounded cheaper than preparation. I listened without interrupting, hands folded, feeling something tight coil in my chest. I wasn't angry. I was being reduced, converted into a cost center that talked too much. Then my phone vibrated. An automated HR email arrived, polite and perfectly timed, confirming that all system access had been revoked effective immediately. No appeal, no delay. Exactly as written in the policy I authored. I closed the message and smiled. Thinly, being disposable. It turned out, required very precise rules after all indeed. I walked out of the building without turning back. No dramatic exit. No last glance at the screens I knew by heart. Just the quiet certainty that I no longer belonged to what was happening inside. The air outside felt colder, sharper, like a line had been drawn and I was on the correct side of it. At home, I set my bag down and did something that felt unnatural after years of conditioning. I did nothing. I didn't log in. I didn't open dashboards. I didn't refresh alerts. My laptop stayed closed. Not out of spite, but out of discipline. Authority had been revoked. Policy was explicit. Control, for once, meant restraint, inside the building. Gordon Sykes filled the silence I left behind. He ordered the new response team to move faster and simplify the process. Speed, he insisted, would compensate for understanding. On the incident bridge, voices overlapped, commands stacking without context. One junior engineer hesitated. I later learned his microphone picked up a quiet objection. She designed this, he said, uncertain but honest. Gordon cut him off immediately. We don't have time for theory. Execute. They did. Without the architectural map in their heads, they bypassed a containment boundary I had spent months refining. Network segmentation, subtle and invisible when respected, collapsed under rushed hands. The ransomware didn't need help finding new paths. It simply followed the opening it was given. By the time payment systems began stalling, the problem had changed shape. What started as a controlled breach crossed into transaction processing. Customer operations froze. Revenue streams flickered. The incident was no longer isolated. I felt none of it in real time. That was the point. Silence didn't mean absence. It meant compliance. I had not abandoned the system. I had stepped away exactly as instructed. Later, as notifications exploded elsewhere, I poured a glass of water and sat down. Calm is often mistaken for indifference. In truth, it is the hardest form of control. That distance gave me clarity, and clarity reminded me that systems fail fastest when leadership confuses urgency with wisdom alone today. I didn't see the panic as it started, but I felt its shape forming anyway. By the time the second wave hit, the numbers told the story clearly enough. The financial impact doubled within the hour. No longer a slow bleed, but a hemorrhage, spreading beyond the original containment zone Gordon had dismissed. Enterprise clients noticed first. Their calls stacked up, lighting up executive lines that were usually silent. Payments are failing. Our transactions are timing out. Is this breach still ongoing? Each question arrived sharper than the last, carrying contracts, penalties, and reputations with it. The incident had crossed from technical inconvenience into business emergency. Inside the war room, Gordon Sykes responded the only way he knew how. Override the manual controls. He ordered, "We can't wait for approvals. Someone mentioned safeguards. Someone else mentioned compliance." Gordon waved it off. "Just get us moving," he snapped. "We'll clean it up later." Legal didn't share his optimism. Counsel joined the call, voices cautious, clipped. They asked who was authorizing changes, who had command authority, who would be accountable if this spiraled further. No one answered directly. The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was fear, carefully disguised. As systems strained, internal messages grew frantic. Teams contradicted each other. Logs filled faster than anyone could read them. The breach no longer had a single owner. Only a growing list of people trying not to be blamed. Then the insurance carrier called. They didn't ask about malware variants or ransom notes. Their question was simpler. Who is currently directing the incident response? The representative asked. We need confirmation of authorized leadership. The room froze again. Heavier this time. Someone mentioned my name, then stopped. Another voice corrected it. Gordon spoke, confident but vague. The insurer pressed harder, requesting documentation, timestamps, authority records from my quiet living room. I knew exactly why that question mattered. The policy was precise. Coverage depended on who touched the system, and when. Panic isn't loud at first. It spreads through glances and unfinished sentences. By the time Gordon realized what was being asked, the damage was done. If you agree that following policy, stepping away, and letting accountability take its course was the right choice, leave any number in the comments. Your voice deserves to be seen and shared. I heard about the meeting later, but the tension was easy to imagine. By then, the breach was no longer just a technical problem. It had turned into a legal one, and everyone in that room understood the shift immediately. The insurance representative joined the call without urgency, which made it worse. When they spoke, the room went quiet. "Before we proceed," the voice said, "we need to confirm who currently has authorization to access the affected systems." No one answered. Then the question landed, clean and unavoidable. "Is Emily Harper still authorized to access the system?" I was not there to see their faces, but I knew the silence that followed. It was the sound of people replaying decisions in their heads, calculating exposure, realizing that timing mattered more than intent. Screens still glowed. Logs kept growing. No one moved. Gordon Sykes cleared his throat. He spoke confidently, but not precisely. He said roles were in transition. He said teams were responding appropriately. He said authority was being handled internally. None of it directly answered the question. The insurance representative didn't interrupt. They let Gordon finish, then asked again. Slower this time. They wanted clarity, documentation, confirmation tied to policy language. They were not interested in improvisation. Legal finally stepped in. Their tone had changed. What had been supportive an hour earlier now sounded cautious, almost distant. Someone asked for timelines. Someone else asked when my access had been revoked. Gordon avoided specifics. That was when the request came through in writing. The insurer asked for my termination records, official notice, timestamps, proof of when authority ended. Coverage depended on it, in that moment. The meeting stopped being about malware. It became about governance, liability, and signatures already placed. Every decision Gordon had rushed through was now a liability being measured. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. The question they didn't want asked had been answered the moment it was spoken. By the time the call ended, everyone understood the real risk was no longer the attack itself, but the decisions surrounding it. I received the update in fragments, filtered through counsel and forwarded emails. But the meaning was unmistakable. The moment the lawyers took over, emotion drained from the room and precision replaced panic. This was no longer about speed. It was about language. The company's attorney opened the policy I had written years earlier and began to read aloud. Slowly, carefully, each clause landed like a weight. The provision was clear: any individual no longer under active contract was prohibited from accessing, directing, or intervening in security operations. No exceptions. No discretion. Authority ended the instant employment did. Then came the second clause. If an unauthorized party intervened during an active incident, the cybersecurity insurance coverage would be rendered void, entirely, not reduced, not contested. Void. Silence followed. Gordon Sykes did not argue this time. He stared at the table, motionless, as if the words had finally caught up with him, for the first time. No one rushed to defend his decisions. Legal didn't soften the language. They couldn't. It was written exactly as intended. I had drafted that policy to protect the company from reckless behavior. I never imagined it would protect the company from its own leadership. The lawyer continued, explaining the implications with clinical calm. Because access had been revoked, and because authority had been ignored afterward, the insurer was no longer obligated to cover the incident. The losses were no longer measured in hourly burn rates. They were absolute. $110,000 per hour had been terrifying. This was something else entirely. Cold justice doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, wrapped in compliance and signatures. And in that room, everyone finally understood that the cost of ignoring rules was now unlimited. No alarms sounded, no voices rose, but accountability settled into place, irreversible and precise, proving that systems fail not from silence, but from leaders who refuse to read the policies they approved themselves. I wasn't in the room, but desperation has a sound, and it travels fast. By the time Gordon Sykes tried to regain control, the narrative was already slipping from his hands. She abandoned the company, Gordon said. Sharp enough to cut? He repeated it, louder. As if volume could turn accusation into fact, he framed my silence as negligence, my absence as betrayal. For a moment, it almost worked. Then, legal intervened. She complied with policy. The attorney replied. Evenly, no emotion, no hesitation. The words landed harder than Gordon's raised voice ever could. Silence wasn't misconduct. It was adherence. That distinction mattered. I had been terminated in the middle of an active incident. My access was revoked by executive order. Continuing to act would have violated governance, breached insurance terms, and exposed the company to criminal liability. I hadn't walked away. I had been removed. The board began to shift. Questions replaced nods. Why was a termination executed during a live attack? Who authorized it? What risk analysis had been performed? Gordon answered in fragments, leaning on urgency, on cost pressures, on speed. None of it sounded sufficient anymore. I listened as directors asked when my warnings had started. How many times I had raised concerns about understaffing, budget cuts, rushed overrides. Someone requested documentation. That was when the emails surfaced. Months of messages appeared on the screen, time-stamped and precise. Subject lines marked high risk, recommendations deferred, concerns dismissed as overly cautious. Each reply carried Gordon's approval, his signature confidence. The room grew quiet again. But this time, it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The story Gordon tried to tell collapsed under its own weight. You can blame silence only until evidence starts speaking. By the end of the meeting, no one was arguing anymore. They were reading. And for the first time, the desperation in Gordon's voice wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at consequences he could no longer outrun. Desperation turned inward, and the room finally understood that silence hadn't caused the damage, but ignoring it had, completely and irrevocably. For everyone present there then, how do you feel about the COO trying to shift blame instead of owning his decision if you agree with that approach? Comment 1. If you don't. Comment 2. Your opinion deserves to be seen. I watched the truth surface the way it always does. Slowly, methodically, without mercy. Once the board requested a full audit trail. The noise stopped and the documents began to speak for themselves. Email threads stretched back months. My warnings were there in plain language, flagged high risk, marked urgent. I outlined what would happen if segmentation failed, what would break if response authority was blurred. Each message ended the same way, asking for approval to act. The replies were just as clear. Gordon Sykes approved budget cuts that stripped redundancy from the system. He rejected requests for additional monitoring hours. He dismissed tabletop exercises as unnecessary delays. In one reply, he wrote, "Acceptable risk, move forward." His signature sat beneath every decision, calm and confident. I wasn't surprised. I had kept those records precisely because memory tends to soften when accountability arrives. What surprised me was how quickly the tone changed once the evidence was undeniable. Legal stopped framing the incident as an operational failure. Finance stopped talking about hourly losses. The conversation shifted to governance, oversight, and executive judgment. Gordon's name appeared on every slide, every authorization, every compromise made in the name of speed. Someone asked if these approvals had been reviewed by the board. The answer was no. Someone else asked whether alternative recommendations had been ignored. The answer was yes. By the end of the review, silence filled the room again. But this time it was different. It wasn't panic or confusion. It was clarity. An internal investigation was formally opened before the meeting ended. Its scope was narrow and precise, and it did not include me. It focused entirely on executive decision-making, risk suppression, and misuse of authority. Truth doesn't need drama. It only needs records. And in this case, the records told a story Gordon could no longer edit. The findings marked the moment his control finally collapsed under documented reality alone. I learned about Gordon Sykes' suspension through a clipped message from legal, sent without commentary. The announcement landed quietly, but its impact was anything but, by then. The damage was undeniable, and the company needed a symbol of control. Gordon was removed from day-to-day authority, escorted out under the language of temporary administrative leave, inside the executive floor. Panic finally reached the top. The CEO demanded updates by the minute, voice rising as advisors spoke in half-sentences. Numbers no longer behaved. The stock slid hard once rumors reached the market, wiping out months of confidence in a single afternoon. Analysts asked questions no one could answer cleanly. This is spiraling. Someone said on a call I was invited to observe, not join. Blame had nowhere left to settle. Gordon's decisions were documented. Legal exposure was real. The collapse wasn't loud, but it was complete, unfolding across screens, calls, and closed doors. The company had lost control of both the narrative and the damage. Late that evening, the CEO called me directly. His tone was careful, rehearsed. "We need you back," he said. Immediately, I listened without interruption. Then I declined. I explained that returning as an employee was not possible, not now, not under the same structure. If they wanted my help, it would be as an independent advisor, with a new contract, defined authority, and written boundaries. No emergency overrides, no informal pressure. There was a pause long enough to matter. "Send the terms," he said quietly. In that moment, the collapse finished its work. Gordon was gone. The stock was still falling, and the company had finally learned that control does not come from titles, but from respecting the systems that keep everything standing. It was a lesson written in losses, contracts, and silence. One they would remember long after the headlines faded and the boardroom lights stopped burning. Behind closed doors forever, and without excuses left, I returned with authority defined in writing and limits that could not be blurred. There were no speeches, no apologies, just signatures and access restored the right way. Once inside, the system responded immediately. Controls locked back into place, payment flows stabilized, and the chaos finally slowed. I worked, doing what I had always done best. This time, no one rushed me. No one asked for shortcuts. Compliance mattered again, because it had already proven its cost. Gordon Sykes did not attend the briefings. His name disappeared from distribution lists, then from the building altogether. There was no announcement, no farewell email. Power left the way it often arrives, without ceremony, as the final reports closed and the damage was contained. I felt no triumph, only balance. Justice does not shout, it settles. I didn't destroy the company. I just stopped protecting it for people who didn't respect the rules. When I look back on everything that happened, the lesson wasn't about winning or proving anyone wrong. It was about boundaries, about knowing where your responsibility ends, even when the world expects you to cross that line to save face or look heroic. Walking away felt wrong in the moment. It felt like being erased. But staying would have meant betraying the very principles I had spent years building into the system and into myself. What surprised me most was how emotional restraint became an act of courage. Doing nothing, deliberately, forced everyone else to confront their choices without a shield. That kind of integrity doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels lonely. It feels risky. But it's honest. And honesty has a way of outlasting noise. Here's the question I want to leave you with. And it isn't comfortable if you were pushed out during a crisis. Would you bend the rules to be seen as indispensable, or would you accept the consequences of doing what's right, even if no one thanks you for it? Which choice would let you sleep at night? If this story put you in that moment with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider subscribing to the channel. One subscription helps this message reach someone who might be standing at the same crossroads right now. A like or a share can quietly help another person realize they're not weak for choosing integrity. By supporting this story, you're not just watching, you're helping courage travel a little farther.